Hi, everybody. I'm back once again with another daily devotion. This devotion is for Friday, August 7th, and we're continuing in this week's theme of God's generosity and our generous and grateful response. Yesterday, I read a little bit of the response of the people to Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost and the challenge that they heard from the apostles to change their minds, open their hearts, recognize the gift of God's forgiveness, and be filled with the gift of God's own Spirit. And so they were, thousands of them. And thus began the Christian era. Just as life itself began with the breath of God in the book of Genesis, so the Christian community begins with the breath of God in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, today I'm going to read a little bit further in that second chapter of Acts, and we'll see how the people responded as they were filled with this generous gift from God, God's own Spirit. This is Acts chapter 2, and I'm going to begin reading at verse 43. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together, and they had all things in common. And they would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, they spent much time together in the temple. They broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. How did the people respond to the gift of God's own Spirit? They let that generosity flow through them. They opened their lives to one another. They shared with one another, both in their fellowship and spending the time that they could together, but also in their practical concern for one another. Now, some have taken this to mean some form of collectivism where the people claimed no private ownership of property. I don't think that's exactly what was going on here, but rather people who had resources, people who had assets, people who had the ability to do so, were willing to share with others who were in need. That's what it says, that they shared all of their things with any who had need. That is to say, it wasn't just a general redistribution of wealth, but rather a targeted generosity towards those who were unable to provide for themselves. You remember when we read in the book of Deuteronomy just a couple of days ago how the gift and graciousness of God, the fruit of the land, was to be shared in the community with the Levites, the priestly class, with the resident aliens in the midst of the communities, with the orphans and the widows who had lost their means of support. This is what happens in the Acts of the Apostles as well. It is no different. It is the same generosity of God, the same creative gift of God's Spirit, animating and filling each one. It's the same Spirit that Moses encountered in the burning bush, the same Spirit that parted the sea and led the pilgrims through the wilderness into the promised land. It's the same Spirit, that cloud, pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, that led the people to the place of abundance, a land flowing with milk and honey, that God wanted them not only to enjoy, but to share, to allow that generosity to continue to flow. And here in the Acts of the Apostles, we see the same spirit at work in the people of God, the spirit that lifts them up and animates their lives, the spirit that fills them with a sense of purpose, of meaning, of joy, of peace, and creates in them a deep and profound sense of community. That same spirit moves them to share, to be generous as God is generous, to give as God gives. Perhaps it's something like what Jesus said: freely you have received, freely give. That's how the Spirit of God expresses generosity towards us, in us, and through us. And so, day by day, they broke their bread in their homes, having their meals, sometimes sharing them together in what they called an agape love feast. But at the same time, they had glad and generous hearts. And the celebration of life that was experienced by that early group of spirit filled believers was so attractive that day by day, numbers were being added. The people surrounding them saw what was going on in this community and found it so attractive, they wanted to be a part of it. That's how the church began. And let's remember, that's how the church will continue from age to age, from generation to generation. It's by the presence and power of God's own creative spirit, moving us to give thanks, to tell our story, to express that generosity in our care for others. Thanks for joining with me today for this devotion and for these daily devotions all week. Our theme has been God's generosity, our grateful and generous response. I hope and pray that these devotions have been helpful and encouraging and inspiring to you. May the Spirit of God fill you, bless you, enrich you, and lift you up into God's generous presence, that you may be an expression of that presence as well. I look forward to being with you again on Sunday for our worship service. It will be a virtual worship service here in this space online. This week, we're also going to be celebrating in worship together with music and praise, as well as a message from God's Word. And I hope that you'll join us. It'll be at 10:30 on Sunday morning, virtually here in this space on YouTube, Facebook, and on our church website at fpcperu.org. We look forward to seeing you then, and then we'll be back again Monday with another daily devotion. May God enrich you and bless you with God's generous spirit. Until then.